Dr. R.G. Stansbury.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank the Chesterton Society for inviting me to give this talk today, and especially to Lou. I do think that conversion of the heart is a great topic for us to consider, and I'm glad to be a part of this. The idea of conversion, or the process of conversion, means a lot of things to a lot of different people. Certainly today, as people use the word conversion to describe various facets of their religious experience, but I think it's also important to appreciate that those patterns or models of conversion have changed or evolved over the years. And without question, the greatest change to those patterns came with the Reformation in the 16th century. But prior to the 16th century, these patterns of conversion had a decidedly different flavor to them. And that's what I'd like to talk about this morning, using the Confessions of St. Augustine and Augustine's conversion to the Catholic faith. When I was in my late teens and early 20s and fairly new to Christianity, people used the term conversion in the context of giving an evangelical testimony. This was usually during a Wednesday night prayer service or perhaps a Sunday night service. The stories were different, but they had similar themes, and they were often quite dramatic. Former sinful life of unbridled sex, drugs, rock and roll, followed by a moment of enlightenment, where the realization and the weight of that life of sin was coupled with the equally fearful notion of spending all of eternity in hell, and that motivates the sinner to then repent and acknowledge Jesus as Savior. These events were intellectual, I suppose, to some degree, and they certainly were emotional. The conversion was deeply personal in terms of a one-on-one encounter with God. It could happen at home, it could happen at a camp meeting, it could happen at church, at a revival meeting or a crusade, just about anywhere. And although they might not understand it at the time, this was the point of justification in the evangelical conversion, a legal transaction involving the imputation of Christ's righteousness on the individual, such that when God the Father looked down upon this person, he would no longer see the individual in all of his sinfulness. He would only see Christ in his righteousness. And if everything went well, of course, the gratuitous sex would stop, hopefully, as would the drinking and drugs, and the Rolling Stones and their sympathy for the devil would be immediately taken out and burned. But the testimony usually ended there at the moment when the sinner received Christ into his heart, the initial act of faith. In a sense, that was the end of the story and of the conversion. The conversion was a punctiliar event. It happened in a moment, and what was accomplished in that moment was believed to be permanent. In a sense, it truly was the end of the story. And of course, there's a long history to this kind of experience in evangelical and Protestant circles. Calvin argued back in the 16th century that while faith had its roots in the knowledge of God's revelation, faith must also take root in the heart, which is true enough. And the subsequent history of Protestantism, particularly its branches that emphasized the emotional and revivalist qualities of conversion, where one must be able to articulate a moment of conversion. This sort of thing is found in every century down to the present. These testimonies were meant to be encouraging, at least as I experienced them. Although the details were different, they function in a way that was similar to a medieval saint's life. They were intended to build up the congregation in faith and encourage us to make deeper commitments to Christ. I don't want in any way to discount the sincerity and reality of these conversion stories, but they are built on a model of conversion and a soteriology that is decidedly Protestant. It's a model that sees conversion as a single event, never to be repeated. And it's interesting to note, I think, that with the number of Catholic conversions these days from various Protestant denominations, or maybe it's because really of the presence of modern media which can broadcast and publish these stories far and wide, that Catholics are starting to have these testimony times. And perhaps the most notable of these is, would be something like EWTN's Journey Home, although these testimonies too have a decidedly different character or tone to them than the typical Baptist testimony time on Sunday evening. But I'd suggest that the differences here are likewise connected to the differences these two groups have about the nature of conversion. Now, I think it's only fair that I should, although Lou outed me earlier, I think it's only fair that I should, I'm a Catholic and I teach in a Wesleyan college, so I have a little bit of an identity crisis. It's only fair that I should confess that I too am one of these Catholic converts who, like Augustine, came into the church later in life after wandering through many theological isms of the day, though in my case they were Protestant isms. I'm not going to go into my conversion story because we're going to have a much better story this afternoon about a gunslinging Brit. And I'm not speaking about G.K. Chesterton. But my own journey home goes back to 1989 when I was a senior at a Baptist college in Ohio and wrote a senior thesis on the celebration of the Lord's Supper in the Apostolic Church, or the Eucharist, as I dared to call it in my paper. My professor was a godly man and a member of the General Association of Regular Baptists. And for the cradle Catholics in the room, these are the very serious Baptists. I think I ended up with an A on that paper, but my professor bled red ink all over those pages, informing me in no uncertain terms that he was not too pleased with some of my conclusions. But from there, it was, of course, all downhill. I went to or uphill, depending on how you look at it. I went to the truly reformed Westminster Seminary, where I led the Protestant Catholic dialogue with seminarians at St. Charles Borromeo in downtown Philadelphia. And I can remember one of the talks given by one of these seminarians about his call to the priesthood and how that call came out of his devotion to the Blessed Virgin. And as you can imagine, with about 15 or so Reformed seminary students in the audience, the discussion after that talk was quite lively and even a bit hostile. I can remember, as though it were yesterday, pleading with my classmates that they, or I should say we Presbyterians, perhaps needed to take seriously the words of the angel Gabriel that Mary was highly favored, or St. Elizabeth's statement that Mary was blessed among women. And I argued, of course, that Christians have given Mary this high honor as a saint of saints since the earliest days of Christianity. And I suggested that it might be just a bit arrogant to disregard 2,000 years of history and barely give her a nod, except for the occasional mention at Christmas or during a Mother's Day sermon. And I can still remember one young professor, he was a professor of church history, in fact. He turned to me and he said, "Well, if it's tradition you want, then why not just become a Jew?" Bizarre. Well, that's about as close to gunslinging as we got there in Machen Hall of Westminster Seminary. But I mention my own background briefly for two reasons. One is a warning of sorts. This is a Chesterton conference, and if the esteemed members of the Rochester Chesterton Society haven't realized yet, they soon will realize their fatal flaw in inviting all of these Catholic converts to come and talk about conversion. You know how rabid we can sometimes be. But actually, I mention my personal background here because it was as a Baptist that I first encountered the work of St. Augustine of Hippo. I remember as a college student, a classmate of mine handed me a copy of Augustine's Confessions and suggested that I take and read this book. It was a classic. and not wanting to be uninformed, I diligently read it and reported back a few days later. I think I stopped reading after book 8, the climax of Augustine's conversion story. I was amazed that there were Baptists back in those days. To me, at the time, it read like a modern Baptist testimonial. Augustine was converted even reading the book of Romans, and everybody knows that Protestants became Protestants by reading Romans. And then later as a Presbyterian, now that's a whole another story that I won't go into, I remember reading Augustine again, this time through the lens of Calvin and the Reformed tradition. And I read Augustine as I read him as a Presbyterian. Sure enough, I was astonished that there were Calvinists back in the late 4th century. After all, this was Augustine who defeated Pelagianism in a fight over the question of human will and the profound and devastating effects of original sin, which was what I thought Calvinism was all about. And of course, the Reformers went back to Augustine again and again as evidence of how the early church believed in the supremacy of divine grace and human salvation over and against human effort, which, according to them, apparently got all messed up in those awful and dark years of the Middle Ages. I'm a medievalist by training. And again, to be fair, it's not hard to read Augustine this way, particularly in his Confessions. I think I realized, perhaps after the beginning of my own conversion to the Catholic Church, that I had completely ignored the context in which Augustine lived, and I had especially ignored the church and faith to which Augustine had converted. I began to realize, of course, that one of the problems with Augustine is quite simply that he's one of those larger-than-life figures, a kind of a mythic figure in a sense. And this particular book, his Confessions, is one of those classics that, in fact, suffers from being a classic. What do I mean by this? Well, just to make sort of a parenthetical and preliminary comment here, from the historian's perspective, one of the most difficult sources to interpret is the autobiography. There are a number of interpretive complexities that exist between, in the case of Augustine, understanding the conversion itself, that is the actual affective and intellectual experience of Augustine at the moment, and the text or the artwork we have before us in the Confessions, a text written around 397 AD, some decade or so after the events recorded. In other words, before I actually say anything about Augustine's Confessions and his conversion experience, I think it's important to appreciate that there is something of this dichotomy that exists between the actual experience of Augustine's conversion and our interpretation of the events as we look at them through Augustine's own lens, his memory, his interpretation of the event. We are, as it were, observing the artistic, literary expression of a memory in the mind of the artist or author. And what complicates things even further for us is that in this case, we're dealing with someone who lived some 1,600 years ago. And this gets me back to my point of looking at Augustine as a Baptist or a Presbyterian and even as a Catholic. At every level of interpretation, there is potential for change, interpretive change. And I think this is partly how it is that scholars can come up with a myriad of Augustines, or a myriad of Pauls, for that matter, all of them hotly defended by an appeal to the exact same data. We could talk about this issue in the case of Newman's Apologia, written in 1864, some 20 years after the main event of 1845. And so there is this common tendency, as Belloc actually put it, in warning his readers about Luther's autobiographical comments in 1545, some 30 years after the posting of the 95 Theses. He said that there is this tendency among writers of autobiography to read one's own excitements of the of the subsequent controversy into an earlier experience. Now, while this is a common practice, it can, and I just mention this because it can be extremely difficult for those of us who are trying to understand these works, especially in the case of Augustine, an author who's separated from us, from the modern reader, by almost 2 millennia. Now, as you can imagine, the literature on St. Augustine is immense. Historians, theologians, literary scholars, even psychologists have sliced and diced Augustine in many, many different ways. In fact, one of the most frustrating things about studying Augustine, at least in the secondary literature, is that he's often treated as a kind of disembodied head, a mind, an intellect that exists apart from a real historical context, a theologian, a philosopher, a rhetorician, a polemicist, an apologist, and the list goes on and on. And I might just say that this is what makes Peter Brown's famous biography of Augustine so enduring and relevant even after its first publication some 40 years ago. Brown masterfully penetrates not just the mind, but also the milieu of Augustine. Brown places the feet of this otherwise mythic figure firmly in the soil of late Roman antiquity. Now, I'd have to say that the majority of modern scholars who look at the Confessions look at this book as an intellectual conversion away from his earlier Manichaean ties. Manichaean was a dualistic religion from Persia, Gnostic religion. As a conversion away from his early Manichaean ties and ties to the Neoplatonism of his day to the Catholic faith. In other words, much of the modern scholarship is concerned with the Confessions as a quasi-therapeutic and internal quest of a Neoplatonic philosopher and rhetorician who comes into contact first and foremost with the Holy Scriptures and the claims of the Catholic Church. This is true, for example, in Knox's classic work on conversion from the mid-30s, and I'd suggest that it's still found, although to a lesser degree, it's still found in the work of Brown, and certainly in the case of more recent work on this topic. In addition to looking at the Confession through the philosophical and intellectual lens, there are also people who look at his conversion more closely through the non-philosophical influences in Augustine's life. And here, the role of Monica, Augustine's mother, is where people usually turn. Even for the casual reader of the Augustines, there's no doubt that she is the dominant figure of earthly admiration in Augustine's self-reflection. He writes of her death in Book 9 and says, "Her life and mine had been as one." To a lesser degree, Augustine's father, Patricius, contributed in some fashion to Augustine's own personality and even to his conversion. Some scholars have seen these two figures as an illustration, in fact, of the Pauline theme found in Romans 7, a theme which is so prominent in the Confessions of this volitional conflict or war between the desire to do what is right and the desire to do what is wrong. Monica represents godliness and right behavior, and Patricius represents the old man, theologically, and bad behavior. Now, I want to pick up on this theme of Monica as the Pauline representation of the will to do what is right, an attempt to get to the heart, if you will, of Augustine's conversion. Now, while it's tempting to see this in strictly Pauline or perhaps Neoplatonic terms of spirit, Monica, versus flesh, Patricius, I want to take it into a slightly different direction. What I'd like to do is take a look at Augustine through the lens of what I believe was his primary model of conversion to the Catholic Church. And Monica, to one degree or another, was a living exemplar of this model. The model to which I refer was not unique to Augustine, but it was a model that he helped to promote in the West by the publication of the Confessions. And it was a model of conversion that would dominate the West until the Reformation. And I have to say this with no offense intended to anyone here. I have to say this because I read Augustine for so many years. In a way, this is sort of my own little confession to him as a Roman Catholic bishop. I read Augustine for so many years. His conversion was not a Baptist model of conversion. It was not a Presbyterian or Reformed model of conversion, and how I could read this story over and over again and not see this baffles me even to this day. The model of conversion represented over and over again in the Confessions, the one that was, I think, at the heart and mind of Augustine's conversion, was decidedly ascetic and monastic in character. He was, in a real sense, a watershed figure between the ancient and medieval worlds. And I think this is all the more striking when you consider how the Protestant reformers were so quick to warm up to Augustine as a proto-Protestant, or, to be fair to them, as the early church authority before the church went to pot in the Middle Ages. But they misrepresent him. They misread him. He was not a Protestant by any stretch of the imagination. His model of conversion certainly moved away from earlier notions of conversion, for example, conversion as martyrdom, to a new model of conversion characterized by the ascetic monastic life. In other words, the ideal of Monica, I think, was the ideal of monasticism and asceticism. Now, it may be that one of the reasons why Baptists or Presbyterians can warm up to the conversion story of Augustine is that it is, without question, it does have a strong intellectual bent to it. A large part of the story is, as I have said, the intellectual quest to the Christian life, a philosophical quest, a mental quest of wrestling with the claims of the Manichaeans, of the Neoplatonists, and the like. Even in his famous garden scene in Book 8, the climax of this conversion story, there is this voice of a child calling out to him, "Take and read, take and read." The image here, of course, is of a man and his books. It is the scholarly conversion. And in thinking about this conversion along intellectual lines, one can see how attractive that line of thinking can be. It fits our image of this man. It fits Augustine as the intellectual, as the philosophical, as the theological giant. The notion that Augustine was converted under the influences of monastic humility and discipline, as it comes down to us in the West through someone like Benedict of Nursia or Bernard of Clairvaux, seems at first thought to be beneath him. And I think this might explain why the monastic character of his conversion is rarely, and I mean rarely, if at all, mentioned in the literature on this topic. That's remarkable to me. But I think that to miss this point is to miss the full picture of what Augustine actually converted to. It misses, if you will, the heart of Augustine's conversion. Becoming a true Christian was more than just coming to know intellectually the true God as opposed to some unknown God of the Neoplatonists. As important as that is, it was more than just recognizing intellectually that Jesus was the true mediator between God and man. What conversion involved for Augustine was the lifetime submission of the heart. And the model he had for that submission was not simply a verbal or intellectual acclamation that Jesus is Lord. It was not even a prayer asking Jesus into his heart to be his personal Savior. the model for Augustine was what would become the model for most, if not all, conversions, until the very real dissolution of the monasteries in 1538 by King Henry VIII. Very symbolic as well as real event. And that model for Augustine was obedience. An obedience that began first with baptism, followed by a life of taking up the yoke of Christ, as Bernard of Clairvaux would describe it so eloquently in the 12th century. Of following Jesus' command to the rich young ruler to sell everything you have and give to the poor and come and follow me. What I think should be striking to the reader of this work is not just how Augustine works through the intellectual traditions of the day, but how he wrestles with the command of Jesus to follow him. His struggle with temptation, sexual temptation, sin, this story about the seemingly innocent theft of some pears, the worldliness, vanity, pride, wealth, and the like. What should be striking to the reader is not just how often Porphyry or Plotinus appears in this story, but how often Anthony of Egypt appears in the story. Why is it that we miss the overt and covert references to St. Anthony of Egypt in this text? Again, perhaps it strikes us as offensive, that is, monastic humiliation, or to put it in biblical imagery, the offense of the cross. After all, this is Augustine. How can someone of this intellectual stature, person who was admired by every intellectual in the history of the West, even Nietzsche liked Augustine. And Nietzsche didn't like anyone except himself. And I'm not even sure he liked himself. How could anyone of this intellectual stature model his life, model his conversion on an uneducated cave dweller in Egypt? It's not unlike asking the question, how can the God of the universe be born in a manger and die a criminal's death on a cross outside the holy city of Jerusalem? Although Augustine doesn't say it in so many words, I can't help but think that he intends this message to be heard loudly by the intellectual community of his day. There's a line in Book 9 when he calls his teaching job a professorship of lies. And I can't help but think that he's trying to communicate something about the vanity of knowledge for knowledge's sake to his audience. But to miss this point is to misunderstand Augustine, the man, Augustine the bishop, Augustine the Catholic monk. To separate Augustine the intellect from Augustine the religious, to separate the mind from the heart, to separate the intellectual from the affective, is in a sense to distort him and to kill him. If we are going to deal with Augustine the theologian, we also have to deal with Augustine the ascetic. Now, as I said earlier, Augustine was not the originator of this model of conversion, but he certainly was one of several authors to help transmit these ideas into the West. Ancient models of conversion cover everything from the normative, kind of sacramental conversion of baptism, the actual moment of regeneration, to the military conversions of people like Constantine or Clovis. One might see this as a sort of Old Testament conversion following the God who promises victory in war. To early conversions connected to things like exorcisms or some other exotic demonstration of spiritual power. Baptism, of course, was technically the start of the Christian life, and therefore, in a sense, it was the beginning of a life of conversion. But again, one must keep in mind that conversion, that is, the turning away from something, evil, sin, etc., turning towards something else, namely God, was believed to be a lifelong process. In the early days of Christianity, particularly in the days of the church martyrs, martyrdom was the goal of that conversion. Probably the best example of this mentality is found in the writings of Ignatius of Antioch, who clearly believed that being a martyr was the essence of being a true Christian. But from the 5th century on, ascetic confessors, monks, and soon-to-be monk bishops began to rival the popularity of this martyr model of conversion. There are many examples of this, but for our purposes, let me just mention St. Anthony of Egypt because, for one, he has a direct connection here to Augustine in the Confessions. Anthony died in 356 AD, and it was Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, who wrote the life of St. Anthony shortly after his death. The life was translated into Latin and quickly transmitted to the West and was certainly read by Augustine. As you would expect, the life lays out all the fundamental ascetic disciplines: abandoning the world, celibacy, poverty, prayer, fasting, simplicity, manual labor, and seclusion. And from the very opening pages, the life describes Anthony selling all of his possessions and giving them away to the poor, after which he made his way to the desert tombs and caves outside of Egypt. And there he lived a life of prayer and manual labor, all the while fighting a spiritual war with the devil and performing many amazing miracles. Another figure in this new monastic model of conversion was Martin of Tours, a contemporary of St. Augustine. Martin died in 397 AD, around the same time as Augustine was writing his Confessions. Martin grew up in Italy in a military family, and at the age of 12, we're told that he longed for the desert. He was baptized at 18. He served in the army under Emperor Julian. Later on, he was made Bishop of Tours in Gaul. And as bishop, he adopted all the basic characteristics of the monastic life: poverty, he lived in a cell, seclusion, fasting, prayer, and the like. And as bishop, he lived in community with other disciples or brothers. In the 6th century, one can look to the life of Caesarius of Arles, written by several of his companions a few years after his death in 542. This was a very popular life of this early medieval bishop, and his life is described principally as the life of a monk. He was a man who abandoned the world, who was forced to become bishop, and as bishop lived as best he could the life of an ascetic. So by the time we get to the 6th century, the triumph of this monastic model was complete. And I haven't here even mentioned Benedict of Nursia, who would provide the monastic ideal with a clearly defined rule. When Augustine wrote his Confessions, probably around 397, he'd been bishop in Africa for just a few years. The climate of spirituality in those days was decidedly ascetic, and it would remain that way, I'd suggest, for the next 1,200 years or so, until the Reformation. Now, that's not to say that every bishop was a monk or that every bishop even tried to live like a monk, but this was the ideal. And the people who were reading the Confessions in the Middle Ages were certainly bishops. So allow me to just offer a brief glimpse of this sort of thing. I can't march you through everything, but hopefully I've given you something of a framework for you to go back and read this text again using a slightly different lens. In fact, I'm going to assume here that almost everyone is familiar to some degree with the Confessions of St. Augustine. And if not, there are priests here who would be happy to hear your own confession after the message. Okay. But just so you don't think I'm completely out of my mind for suggesting that Augustine's conversion is first and foremost monastic, let me just read a small excerpt from the life of St. Augustine, written by a man named Posidius. Posidius was a close friend of Augustine and fellow bishop in North Africa. Posidonius lived for about 3 years in the small seaside town of Hippo, and he was with Augustine when he died in 430 AD. There's nothing particularly unusual about this saint's life, but here's what he says. He says, soon after his baptism, with every fiber of his being, he renounced all his ambitions for this world. He no longer thought of a wife or children or wealth or worldly honors, but resolved to serve God amongst God's people, desiring to be one of that little flock whom the Lord was addressing when he said, fear not, little flock, for it is the Father's pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions, give alms, making purses for yourself that do not grow old, and a treasure in heaven that never fails, and so on. And what our Lord said on another occasion, this holy man conceived the desire to act on. If you will wish for perfection, sell all you have, give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Come and follow me. Of course, this passage from the Gospels is very familiar to the monastic tradition of the West. It was, if you will, the John 3:16 of the Middle Ages. And it was one, for example, which would motivate St. Francis of Assisi in the 12th century to give away his father's wealth and become a poor beggar for the Lord. A little later in the life, Posidonius writes of Augustine, once a priest, it was not long before he established a monastery within the precincts of the church and entered upon a life with the servants of God in accordance with the method and rule established by the holy apostles. Above all, no one in that community might have anything of his own, but they were to hold everything in common, and it was to be distributed to each one as he had need of it. And on it goes. So even when Augustine is embroiled in all the affairs of pastoral care and fighting against the heretics of his day, this ideal, I think, is always in the background, and it's an ideal of poverty, humility, chastity, and the like. And these monastic themes, which one finds so prominent in the life of Augustine, are all through the Confessions. Now, I'm purposely going to skip over what we might call his intellectual conversion. However, even here, I'd just like to mention something. For all his intellectual adventures, Augustine comes back time and again to the theme of intellectual pride, vanity in attaining knowledge for knowledge's sake, or simply for establishing one's own name. He writes as early as Book 1, look down, my Lord, with patience on how the sons of men most carefully observe the agreed rules of letters and syllables, which they received from those who spoke before them, and yet pay no attention to the eternal covenant of everlasting salvation, which they received from you. And he writes again, I was more frightened of committing a barbarism, a slip of the tongue, if you will, than I was careful to avoid envying those who had not. Of course, Augustine develops this theme more fully in his De Doctrina Christiana, which Augustine started to write around 396 AD, just after he became Bishop of Hippo. And here he argues what I think would become the essential monastic approach to learning in the West, which is that we use the things of this world ultimately to better understand that which is eternal and spiritual, the so-called spoil of the Egyptians approach. Whether it's the writing of the fathers, sacred scripture, or even pagan classics, which of course monks read on a regular basis, what comes down to us in the West as this monastic lectio divina is essentially a divine reading that is oriented toward meditation, prayer, compunction, and ultimately the beatific vision of God. It's not a scholastic model of the medieval schools where it was argued, where it was believed to be such that knowledge was sought for clarity's sake, for science. You learn things to clarify. and not for the greater purpose of attaining God. One finds these debates over and over again in the 13th century. There's this wonderful story by Jacques de Vitry, who was a 13th century bishop and cardinal. And he tells the story of a master of arts who was frightened by a dream in which the tormented soul of one of his students appeared to him and chastised him. And in the dream, the student's covered by a heavy cope, and on that cope contains all kinds of beautiful writing. And the student points to that writing and he says, "All these things are vain sophisms you taught me in the schools." And after that, the master awoke from his dream. He was so terrified, so frightened, that he resigned his chair in the university and immediately took the Cistercian habit and became a monk. And I think Augustine would have appreciated this point about knowledge and the goal of learning. So I'd suggest that even when we think about Augustine the intellectual, we need to appreciate this search for truth through a monastic lens of meditation, prayer, and devotion. But there are other more basic elements to Augustine as monk. First of all, I'd point to what was essentially the fundamental part of monastic life, that is detachment from the world, and especially detachment from sin. Anyone who's ever read the Confessions will recognize immediately that Augustine spends a great deal of time wrestling with this and ultimately man's wretchedness, coming ultimately, of course, from original sin. Gregory the Great, another of these early monastic bishops, would pick up on this and talk about it in great detail. Augustine spends a lot of time involved in this deep introspection regarding his sin. And while he observes and confesses his debauchery with regard to sexual pleasure, his most penetrating observations have to do with his theft of some roadside pears as a young boy in Book 2. He writes, "I became evil for nothing, with no reason for wrongdoing except the wrongdoing itself. What monstrosity of life and what abyss of death! Could I enjoy what was forbidden for no other reason except that it was forbidden?" One gets the impression that when Augustine talks about his sexual proclivities, he's talking about giving in to some basic human temptations that are at least connected to human nature, to procreation and the like. But what's astounding to him in the story about the pears is the evil that he detects in his own being when he does something that is, on the surface at least, rather silly and meaningless, just for the sake of becoming a thief. So there are these great passages that reflect this profound awareness of his own misery, his own wretchedness. That is the weight and the gravity of sin that attracts us to this earth and ultimately leads to death. This deep introspection leads to compunction of the heart. And the recognition that conversion brings with it a lifelong detachment from the world and the desires of the world. And that is the essence of the monastic life. Another element that goes hand in hand here with the notion of detachment was poverty, monastic poverty. Augustine writes that he panted for honors, money, and marriage. And what he would get in turn was humility, poverty, and celibacy. He tells the story in Book 6 of coming across a poor, drunk beggar in the streets of Milan. And he stares at this man in amazement. He's with his buddies. He stares in amazement because he finds that this man is happy. He's laughing. He's enjoying himself. And Augustine wonders how such an impoverished, poor man could be happy. He talks to his friends, and they discuss how miserable they are, toiling away, spurred on by desire and ambition and madness. And yet, here is this beggar who had reached happiness before us. He writes, with a few pennies that he had managed to beg, he actually obtained what I, by so many painful turns in such devious ways, was struggling to reach, namely the joy of temporary happiness. Without any doubt, he was the happier, not only because he was drenched in merriment while I was eaten up with anxieties, but also because he, by wishing people good luck, had got some wine for himself. And I, by lying, was seeking for an empty bubble of praise. Augustine was wrestling with the demands of Jesus to sell all you have and give to the poor. He was wrestling with the monastic vow of poverty and the principle behind it, which is he who is last shall be first. And if I can return to the life of Augustine for just a second, Posidonius tells us that after Augustine's death, that he made no will, because as one of God's poor, he left nothing to leave. He had nothing to leave. In addition to this detachment from the world and monastic poverty, even before his conversion, Augustine envisioned a life in community with his friends, another monastic characteristic. He tells us in his Confessions that he had discussed this at some length with his friends. And he wrote that he had almost reached the conclusion that we would retire from the crowd and live a life of peace. In order to achieve this, he planned to pool our resources, to make one common property out of the property of us all, so that in sincerity of friendship there would be no distinction between what belonged to one man or another. All our possessions would count as one piece of property. Well, of course, the communal life was a key feature of monastic culture in the Middle Ages, and it was even adopted by the canons regular in the Middle Ages, following the very example of Augustine and his monastic community in Hippo. Another of these themes, chastity and celibacy, comes through over and over again in these pages. He writes in the beginning of Book 8 that he was closely bound by the need for a woman. He knew that Paul had argued for celibacy as something better, but he says he lacked the strength and was inclined to choose the softer place. I like that. I don't tell that to my wife, but I like that. And because of this one thing, everything else within me was in confusion. By the time we get to the end of that book, he's reflecting on the greater joy his mother will have in the knowledge of Augustine's conversion to celibacy than the joy she might have had through grandchildren in the flesh. All of these themes come out over and over again in Book 8 during the famous climax of Augustine's conversion, the point where he moves from his compunction over sin or detachment from the world, the first element of the monastic life, to the second part of that life, a deep desire and love for God. He writes of the garden scene, I was mad and dying. I knew how evil I was. I did not know how well I would be soon. And when we get to this famous scene, we find Augustine wrestling not over an emotional appeal to walk down the aisle to the tune of Just As I Am would never suffice. Rather, we find him wrestling with whether or not he had it in him to give up the pleasures of this world, financial success, and marriage. He knew that monastic life, the Christian life, the life of a Christian, was a life of poverty, chastity, and humility, and these were polar opposites. And again, in the background of this scene, this very scene in Book 8 is none other than St. Anthony of Egypt, introduced to Augustine at this time by a man named Pontikianus, an African member of the imperial court. Augustine was amazed to hear of the stories of St. Anthony. And if you've never read the life of St. Anthony, I would commend it to you. It's a wonderful reading. And he was especially taken by the fact that these miracles had taken place so recently, in our own times, he writes. He was, of course, familiar with Paul and the New Testament, but Anthony was a contemporary account of what were essentially the same sorts of New Testament-like miracles from a poor, uneducated, wandering monk. And Augustine goes on in the same section to discuss the monastery under the care of the great St. Ambrose outside the walls of Milan. The whole flavor of chapter 6 and 7 of this book, that is book 8, is monastic, and it rarely gets even an honorable mention in the literature on this famous scene. Just before describing the garden scene in Milan, Augustine almost screams to his friends, "What is wrong with us? The unlearned," and I think here he has in mind St. Anthony and all of his buddies, "the unlearned rise up and take heaven by force, while we, with all of our learning, are wallowing in flesh and blood." And for the next several chapters, he's wrestling with this monastic call to conversion to a higher life. "I hesitated to die to death and to live to life," he wrote. "Toys and trifles, other vanities had been my mistresses, and now they were holding me back. From this moment on, will you never for all eternity be allowed to do this or to do that?" he asks himself. And it was there, after flinging himself down under a fig tree, that Augustine hears the words of a child speak to him. "Take and read, tolle lege." And immediately he remembers Anthony and Anthony's story and how this great eremitic saint was called from the Gospels to go and sell everything you have and give to the poor and come and follow me. And when Augustine goes back and finds Paul's letters, he opens up to Romans and he reads, "Not in rioting and in drunkenness, not in wantonness, not in strife and in envy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh." And like Anthony before him, and every other monk in the history of the West since, Augustine immediately surrenders his life. And that was the beginning of his conversion. And it was a conversion to the monastic life. So I'd suggest that Augustine is an example par excellence of what Jean Leclerc would describe as the essence of monastic culture and life. That is, the love of learning and the desire for God. It's ironic to me that Luther became an observant Augustinian friar in the city of Erfurt, living under the rule of St. Augustine, before he later rejected that life for what he called passive holiness. That's what Luther called it, passive holiness, not an active holiness. For Augustine, Jesus was not calling him to a passive life of holiness. Jesus was calling Augustine to follow, to take up his cross and follow, to abandon the world and follow, to leave his hope for a future wife and follow. He writes at the end of Book 8, "You converted me to you in such a way that I no longer sought a wife nor any other worldly hope." That's what Jesus said, I think, when he instructed his disciples that anyone who is not willing to forsake everything for me is not fit for the kingdom of heaven. Following Paul and St. Anthony, Augustine found in the monastic life an answer to that struggle against sin and temptation and the deep visceral desire to know and to love God. Even when he was called to be a bishop, which he took under much reluctance, he understood that he would come to what would come to characterize Western Christian spirituality for the next 1,200 years, and that is that the Christian life could only be lived in the cloister, and that serious religious commitment meant becoming a monk. And it was to this life that even clerics and lay people would also be called. And people like Augustine, Gregory, Caesarius of Arles, Martin of Tours, and others would provide that literary example for centuries to priests and bishops. When one looks at the slew of famous ad succurrendum conversions, that is, these near-death conversions. They are conversions to the cloister. Peter the Chanter, who was the dean of theology at Paris in the late 12th century, ended his days as a monk. Alan of Lille left the schools for Citeaux, and many other examples of clerical and lay Catholics ending their days in the monastery. This is the model of conversion that would dominate the West until the Reformation. Augustine regarded his conversion as one of the most important events in his life. As an older man in his mid-70s, he looked back on his lifetime of work and wrote that these 13 books of my confessions still move me when I read them now as they moved me when I first wrote them. But when you look at what it was that Augustine actually converted to, detachment from the world, poverty, celibacy, a life in community, regular prayer, strict discipline, and devotion, all of a sudden Augustine is not looking like a Baptist or a Presbyterian anymore. At least no Baptists or Presbyterians I've ever known. I was duped. When one reads this story, one's confronted with a model of conversion learned from the Desert Fathers and passed down from generation to generation for the next 1,200 years, really to the present. It's a model learned from Jesus himself, the first monk, who lived a life separate from the world, in community with his brothers, a life of celibacy, no matter what Dan Brown says, and a life of poverty. In a sense, Augustine was simply following in the footsteps of his Lord. Thank you.